Hello, the Vela. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're excited. Had to run an update on Streamlabs, apparently. So it took me another couple minutes. And then, of course, the stream was set to mature. And we're all about the immaturity here, so couldn't be having a mature stream. Not allowed. So, how is everyone today? Much better than yesterday? Anybody watch the inauguration? You slept through it. I might have teared up a little bit. I'm really glad that things are changing. I just hope that they become more sane in the world now. It's important. It matters who speaks for you guys. It really does. So I'm hoping that the world will be a better place moving forward. Fingers crossed. All right, so I hope everybody got the message that there wasn't going to be a stream yesterday. I've discontinued the Tuesday streams. I had put it out in the previous stream and I edited the schedules and calendars and I posted in the Discord. So hopefully nobody showed up and was like, what the heck? But if you did, I am very sorry. I apologize for that. But today we're going to continue with our new mystery novel, The Clue of the Twisted Candle. So let's go ahead and get started on that. By the way, I really love the pictures I've been getting of people who picked up copies of Baudelaire because of the reading on the stream. I think that's amazing, and it's really awesome. And I hope you guys enjoy it. If you come across a poem of his that you particularly like, shoot me the title and the section. Different editions will have different page numbers, so can't just do a page number, but the title of the piece and the section, because it's divided into different volumes. And I'll read it on stream for you. But today we are picking up with chapter 5. Just having to adjust the mic a little bit as I'm reading off Kindle on my phone, and the phone was nearly dead, so I'm having to read with it plugged in. Make sure that it doesn't die mid-sentence. I'm afraid I can't give a reading without a teleprompter, or at least a book to read from anyway. All right. Chapter 5. 6 months later, T.X. Meredith was laboriously tracing an elusive line which occurred on an ordnance map of Sussex when the chief commissioner announced himself. All right, so we just jumped ahead 6 months. Seems an interesting mystery novel where we basically know who the murderer was, what their motive was, and then we jump 6 months right in the middle of the case. Interesting. For those of you just popping in, we're just getting started on our mystery novel. When the chief commissioner announced himself, Sir George described TX as the most wholesome corrective a public official could have, and never missed an opportunity of meeting his subordinate, as he said, for this reason. "What are you doing there?" he growled. "The lesson this morning," said TX without looking up, "is maps." Sir George passed behind his assistant and looked over his shoulder. "That is a very old map you have got there," he said. 1876. It shows the course of a number of interesting little streams in this neighborhood, which have been lost sight of, for one reason or the other, by the gentleman who made the survey at a later period. I am perfectly sure that in one of these streams I shall find what I am seeking. You haven't given up hope, then, in regard to Lexman? I shall never give up hope, said TX, until I am dead, and possibly not then. Let me see, what did he get? 15 years. 15 years, repeated TX, and a very fortunate man to escape with his life. Sir George walked to the window and stared out onto busy Whitehall. I am told you are quite friendly with Kara again. TX made a noise which might be taken to indicate his assent to the statement. I suppose you know that gentleman has made a very heroic attempt to get you fired, he said. I shouldn't wonder, said TX. I made as heroic an attempt to get him hung, and one good turn deserves another. What did he do? See ministers and people? He did, said Sir George. He's a silly ass, responded TX. I can understand all that. The Chief Commissioner turned round. But what I cannot understand is your apology to him. There are so many things you don't understand, Sir George, said TX tartly, that I despair of ever cataloguing them. You're an insolent cub, growled his chief. Come to lunch. Where will you take me? Asked TX cautiously. To my club. I'm sorry, said the other with elaborate politeness. I have lunched once at your club. Need I say more? He smiled, as he worked after his chief had gone, at the recollection of Kara's profound astonishment and the gratification he strove so desperately to disguise. Kara was a vain man, immensely conscious of his good looks, conscious of his health, of his wealth. He had behaved most handsomely, for not only had he accepted the apology, but he left nothing undone to show his desire to create a good impression upon the man who had so grossly insulted him. TX had accepted an invitation to stay a weekend at Kara's little place in the country, and had found there assembled everything that the heart could desire in the way of friendship, eminent politicians who might conceivably have service to an ambitious young assistant commissioner of police, beautiful ladies to interest and amuse him. Kara had even gone to the length of engaging a theatrical company to play Sweet Lavender, and for this purpose the big ballroom at Hever Court had been transformed into a theater. As he was undressing for bed that night, TX remembered that he had mentioned to Kara that Sweet Lavender was his favorite play, and he realized that the entertainment was got up especially for his benefit. In a score of other ways, Kara had endeavored to consolidate the friendship. He gave the young commissioner advice about a railway company which was operating in Asia Minor, and the shares of which stood a little below par. TX thanked him for the advice, and did not take it, nor did he feel any regret when the shares rose £3 in as many weeks. TX had superintended the disposal of Beston Priory. He had the furniture removed to London, and had taken a flat for Grace Lexman. She had a small income of her own, and this, added to the large royalties which came to her, as she was bitterly conscious, in increasing volume as a result of the publicity of the trial, placed her beyond fear of want. 15 years, murmured TX, as he worked and whistled. There had been no hope for John Lexman from the start. He was in debt to the man he killed. His story of threatening letters was not substantiated. The revolver, which he said had been flourished at him, had never been found. 2 people believed implicitly in the story, and a sympathetic Home Secretary had assured TX personally that if he could find the revolver and associate it with the murder beyond any doubt, John Lexman would be pardoned. Every stream in the neighborhood had been dragged. In one case, a small river had been dammed, and the bed had been carefully dried and sifted, but there was no trace of the weapon, and TX had tried methods more effective and certainly less legal. A mysterious electrician had called at 456 Cadogan Square in Kara's absence, and he was armed with such indisputable authority that he was permitted to penetrate to Kara's private room in order to examine certain fitments. Kara, returning next day, thought no more of the matter when it was reported to him, until going to his safe that night, he discovered that it had been opened and ransacked. As it happened, most of Kara's valuable and confidential possessions were at the bank. In a fret of panic and at considerable cost, he had the safe removed and another put in its place of such potency that the makers offered to indemnify him against any loss from burglary. TX finished his work, washed his hands, and was drying them when Mansus came bursting into the room. It was not usual for Mansus to burst into anywhere. He was a slow, methodical, painstaking man with a deliberate and an official manner. "What's the matter?" asked TX quickly. "We didn't search Vasilaro's lodgings," cried Mansus breathlessly. "It just occurred to me as I was coming over Westminster Bridge. I was on top of a bus." "Wake up," said TX. "You're amongst friends, and cut all that bus stuff out. Of course we searched Vasilaro's lodgings." "No, we didn't, sir," said the other triumphantly. "He lived in Great James Street." "He lived in Adelphi," corrected TX. "There were 2 places where he lived," said Mansus. "When did you learn this?" asked his chief, dropping his flippancy. "This morning. I was on a bus coming across Westminster Bridge, and there were 2 men in front of me, and I heard the word Vasilaro, and naturally I pricked up my ears." "It was very unnatural, but proceed," said TX. One of the men, a very respectable person, said, "That chap Vasilaro used to lodge in my place, and I've still got a lot of his things. What do you think I ought to do?" "And you said," suggested the other. "I nearly frightened his life out of him," said Mansus. "I said, 'I am a police officer, and I want you to come along with me.' And of course he shut up and would not say another word," said TX. "That's true, sir," said Mansus. "But after a while I got him to talk. Vasilaro lived in Great James Street, 604 on the 3rd floor. In fact, some of his furniture is still there. He had good reason for keeping 2 addresses by all accounts." TX nodded wisely. "What was her name?" he asked. "He had a wife," said the other, "but she left him about 4 months before he was killed. He used the Adelphi address for business purposes, and apparently he slept 2 or 3 nights of the week at Great James Street. I've told the man to leave everything as it is, and that we will come round." 10 minutes later, the 2 officers were in the somewhat gloomy apartments which Vasilaro had occupied. The landlord explained that most of the furniture was his, but that there were certain articles which were the property of the deceased man. He added, somewhat unnecessarily, that the late tenant owed him 6 months' rent. The articles which had been the property of Vasilaro included a tin trunk, a small writing bureau, a secretary bookcase, and a few clothes. The secretary was locked, as was the writing bureau. The tin box, which had little or nothing of interest, was unfastened. The other locks needed very little attention. Without any difficulty, Mansus opened both. The leaf of the bureau, when let down, formed the desk, and piled up inside was a whole mass of letters, opened and unopened, accounts, notebooks, and all the paraphernalia which an untidy man collects. Letter by letter, TX went through the accumulation without finding anything to help him. Then his eye was attracted by a small tin case thrust into one of the oblong pigeonholes at the back of the desk. This he pulled out and opened, and found a small wad of paper wrapped in tinfoil. "Hello, hello," said TX, and he was pardonably exhilarated. So I'm guessing that was probably the same type of paper that the letter that burned itself was made of. Chapter 6. A man stood in the speckless courtyard before the governor's house at Dartmoor Gaol. He wore the ugly livery of shame which marks the convict. His head was clipped short, and there was 2 days' growth of beard upon his haggard face. Standing with his hands behind him, he waited for the moment when he would be ordered to do his work. John Lexman, A043, looked up at the blue sky as he had looked so many times from the exercise yard, and wondered what the day would bring forth. A day to him was the beginning and the end of an eternity. He dare not let his mind dwell upon the long, aching years ahead. He dare not think of the woman he left, or let his mind dwell upon the agony which she was enduring. He had disappeared from the world he loved, and the world that knew him, and all that there was in life. All that was worthwhile had been crushed and obliterated into the granite of the Princetown quarries, and its wide horizon shrunken by the gaunt moorland with its menacing tors. New interests made up his existence. The quality of the food was one. The character of the book he would receive from the prison library another. The future meant Sunday chapel. The present, whatever task they found him. For the day he was to paint some doors and windows of an outlying cottage. A cottage occupied by a warder who, for some reason, on the day previous, had spoken to him with a certain kindness and a certain respect which was unusual. "Face the wall," growled a voice, and mechanically he turned, his hands still behind him, and stood staring at the gray wall of the prison storehouse. He heard the shuffling feet of the quarry gang. His ears caught the clink of the chains which bound them together. They were desperate men, peculiarly interesting to him, and he had watched their faces furtively in the early period of his imprisonment. He had been sent to Dartmoor after spending 3 months in Wormwood Scrubs. Old hands had told him variously that he was fortunate or unlucky. It was usual to have 12 months at the Scrubs before testing the life of a convict establishment. He believed there was some talk of sending him to Parkhurst, and here he traced the influence which TX would exercise, for Parkhurst was a prisoner's paradise. He heard his warder's voice behind him. "Right turn, 4-3, quick march." He walked ahead of the armed guard, through the great and gloomy gates of the prison, turned sharply to the right, and walked up the village street toward the moors, beyond the village of Princetown, and on the Tavistock Rock where were 2 or 3 cottages, which had been lately taken by the prison staff, and it was to the decoration of one of these that A043 had been sent. The house was as yet without a tenant. A paper hanger under the charge of another warder was waiting for the arrival of the painter. The 2 warders exchanged greetings, and the first went off, leaving the other in charge of both men. For an hour they worked in silence under the eyes of the guard. Presently the warder went outside, and John Lexman had an opportunity of examining his fellow sufferer. He was a man of 24 or 25, lithe and alert, by no means bad-looking. He lacked that indefinable suggestion of animalism which distinguished the majority of the inhabitants at Dartmoor. They waited until they heard the warder's step clear the passage, and until his iron-shod boots were tramping over the cobbled path which led from the door through the tiny garden to the road, before the second man spoke. "What are you in for?" he asked in a low voice. "Murder," said John Lexman laconically. He had answered the question before, and had noticed, with a little amusement, the look of respect which came into the eyes of the questioner. "What have you got?" 15 years, said the other. "That means 11 years and 9 months, said the first man. "You've never been here before, I suppose." "Hardly," said Lexman dryly. "I was here when I was a kid," confessed the paperhanger. "I'm going out next week." John Lexman looked at him enviously. Had the man told him that he had inherited a great fortune and a greater title, his envy would not have been so genuine. Going out. The drive in the brake to the station, the ride to London in creased but comfortable clothing, free as the air, at liberty to go to bed and rise when he liked, to choose his own dinner, and to answer no call save the call of his conscience. To see, he checked himself. "What are you in for?" he asked in self-defense. "Conspiracy and fraud," said the other cheerfully. "I was put away by a woman after 3 of us had got clear with £12,000. Damn rough luck, wasn't it?" John nodded. It was curious, he thought, how sympathetic one grows with these exponents of crimes. One naturally adopts their point of view and sees life through their distorted vision. "I bet I'm not giving away with the next lot," the prisoner went on. "I've got one of the biggest ideas I've ever had, and I've got a real good man to help me." "How?" asked John in surprise. The man jerked his head in the direction of the prison. "Larry Green," he said briefly. "He's coming out next month, too, and we're all fixed up proper. We are going to get the pile, and then we're off to South America, and you won't see us for dust." Though he employed all the colloquialisms which were common, his tone was that of a man of education. And yet There was something in his address which told John, as clearly as though the man had confessed as much, that he had never occupied any social position in life. The warder's step on the stones outside reduced them to silence. Suddenly, his voice came up the stairs. 43, he called sharply. I want you down here. John took his paint pot and brush and went clattering down the uncarpeted stairs. Where's the other man? Asked the warder in a low voice. He's upstairs in the back room. The warder stepped out of the door and looked left and right. Coming up from Princetown was a big gray car. Put down your paint pot, he said. His voice was shaking with excitement. I am going upstairs. When that car comes abreast of the gate, ask no questions and jump into it. Get down into the bottom and pull a sack over you, and do not get up until the car stops. The blood rushed to John Lexman's head, and he staggered. My God, he whispered. Do as I tell you, hissed the warder. Like an automaton, John put down his brushes and walked slowly to the gate. The gray car was crawling up the hill, and the face of the driver was half enveloped in a big rubber mask. Through the two great goggles, John could see little to help him identify the man. As the machine came up to the gate, he leapt into the tonneau and sank instantly to the bottom. As he did so, he felt the car leap forward underneath him. Now it was going fast, now faster. Now it rocked and swayed as it gathered speed. He felt it sweeping downhill and uphill, and once he heard a hollow rumble as it crossed a wooden bridge. He could not detect from his hiding place in what direction they were going, but he gathered they had switched off to the left and were making for one of the wildest parts of the moor. Never once did he feel the car slacken its pace, until, with a grind of brakes, it stopped suddenly. Get out, said a voice. John Lexman threw off the cover and leapt out, and as he did so, the car turned and sped back the way it had come. For a moment, he thought he was alone and looked around. Far away in the distance, he saw the gray bulk of Princeton Gaol. It was an accident that he should see it, but it so happened that a ray of sun fell athwart it and threw it into relief. He was alone on the moors. Where could he go? He turned at the sound of a voice. He was standing on the slope of a small tor. At the foot there was a smooth stretch of greensward. It was on this stretch that the people of Dartmoor held their pony races in the summer months. There was no sign of horses, but only a great bat-like machine with outstretched pinions of taut white canvas, and by that machine a man clad from head to foot in brown overalls. John stumbled down the slope. As he neared the machine, he stopped and gasped. Kara, he said, and the brown man smiled. But I do not understand. What are you going to do? Asked Lexman, when he had recovered from his surprise. I am going to take you to a place of safety, said the other. I have no reason to be grateful to you as yet, Kara, breathed Lexman. A word from you could have saved me. I could not lie, my dear Lexman, and honestly, I had forgotten the existence of the letter, if that is what you are referring to. But I am trying to do what I can for you and for your wife. My wife? She is waiting for you, said the other. He turned his head, listening. Across the moor came the dull, sullen boom of a gun. You haven't time for argument. They've discovered your escape, he said. Get in. John clambered up into the frail body of the machine, and Kara followed. This is a self-starter, he said. One of the newest models of monoplanes. He clicked over a lever, and with a roar the big three-bladed tractor screw spun. The aeroplane moved forward with a jerk, ran with increasing gait for 100 yards, and then suddenly the jerky progress ceased. The machine swayed gently from side to side, and looking over, the passenger saw the ground recede beneath him. Up, up, they climbed in one long sweeping ascent, passing through the drifting clouds till the machine soared like a bird above the blue sea. John Lexman looked down. He saw the indentations of the coast and recognized the fringe of white houses that stood for Torquay. But in an incredibly short space of time, all signs of the land were blotted out. Talking was impossible. The roar of the engines defied penetration. Kara was evidently a skillful pilot. From time to time he consulted the compass on the board before him, and changed his course ever so slightly. Presently he released one hand from the driving wheel, and scribbling on a little block of paper which was inserted in a pocket at the side of the seat, he passed it back. John Lexman read, If you cannot swim, there is a life belt under your seat. John nodded. Kara was searching the sea for something, and presently he found it. Viewed from the height at which they flew, it looked no more than a white speck in a great blue saucer. But presently the machine began to dip, falling at a terrific rate of speed, which took away the breath of the man who was hanging on with both hands to the dangerous seat behind. He was deadly cold, but had hardly noticed the fact. It was all so incredible, so impossible. He expected to wake up and wondered if the prison was also part of the dream. Now he saw the point for which Kara was making. A white steam yacht, long and narrow of beam, was steaming slowly westward. He could see the feathery wake in her rear, and as the aeroplane fell, he had time to observe that a boat had been put off. Then, with a jerk, the monoplane flattened out and came like a skimming bird to the surface of the water. Her engine stopped. "We ought to be able to keep afloat for 10 minutes," said Kara, "and by that time they will pick us up." His voice was high and harsh in the almost painful silence which followed the stoppage of the engines. In less than 5 minutes the boat had come alongside, manned, as Lexman gathered from a glimpse of the crew, by Greeks. He scrambled aboard, and 5 minutes later he was standing on the white deck of the yacht, watching the disappearing tail of the monoplane. Kara was by his side. "There goes 1,500 pounds, said the Greek with a smile. "Add that to the 2,000 I paid the warder, and you have a tidy sum, but some things are worth all the money in the world." Okay, didn't Kara frame him? I mean, why did he rescue him? I could see maybe if he, wanted to dump him in the ocean so he was never found. Chapter 7. T.X. came from Downing Street at 11 o'clock one night, and his heart was filled with joy and gratitude. He swung his stick to the common danger of the public, but the policeman on point duty at the end of the street, who saw him, recognized and saluted him, did not think it fit to issue any official warning. He ran up the stairs to his office and found Mansus reading the evening paper. "My poor dumb beast," said T.X., "I'm afraid I have kept you waiting for a very long time. But tomorrow you and I will take a little journey to Devonshire. It will be good for you, Mansus. Where did you get that ridiculous name, by the way?" "M or N," replied Mansus laconically. "I repeat that there is the dawn of an intellect in you," said T.X. offensively. He became more serious as he took from a pocket inside his waistcoat a long blue envelope containing the paper which had cost him so much to secure. "Finding the revolver was a masterstroke of yours, Mansus," he said, and he was in earnest as he spoke. The man colored with pleasure, for the subordinates of T.X. loved him, and a word of praise was almost equal to promotion. It was on the advice of Mansus that the road from London to Lewes had been carefully covered, and such streams as passed beneath that road had been searched. The revolver had been found after the third attempt between Gatwick and Horsley. Its identification was made easier by the fact that Vassilaro's name was engraved on the butt. It was a rather ornate affair, and in its earlier days had been silver-plated. The handle was of mother-of-pearl. "Obviously the gift of one brigand to another," was T.X.'s comment. Armed with this, his task would have been fairly easy, but into this evidence he added a rough draft of the threatening letter which he had found amongst Vassilaro's belongings, and which evidently had been taken down at dictation, since some of the words were misspelt and had been corrected by another hand. The case was complete. But what clinched the matter was the finding of a wad of that peculiar chemical paper, a number of sheets of which T.X. had ignited for the information of the Chief Commissioner and the Home Secretary by simply exposing them for a few seconds to the light of an electric lamp. Instantly it had filled the Home Secretary's office with a pungent and most disagreeable smoke, for which he was heartily cursed by his superiors. But it had rounded off the argument. He looked at his watch. "I wonder if it is too late to see Mrs. Lexman," he said. "I don't think any hour would be too late," suggested Mansus. "You shall come and chaperone me," said his superior. But a disappointment awaited. Mrs. Lexman was not in, and neither the ringing at her electric bell nor vigorous applications to the knocker brought any response. The hall porter of the flats where she lived was under the impression that Mrs. Lexman had gone out of town. She frequently went out on Saturdays and returned on the Monday, and, he thought, occasionally on Tuesdays. Excuse me. It happened that this particular night was a Monday night, and TX was faced with a dilemma. The night porter, who had only the vaguest information on the subject, thought that the day porter might know more, and aroused him from his sleep. Yes, Mrs. Lexman had gone. She went on the Sunday, an unusual day to pay a week-end visit, and she had taken with her 2 bags. The porter ventured the opinion that she was rather excited, but when asked to define the symptoms, relapsed into a chaos of incoherent you-knows and what-I-means. I don't like this, said TX suddenly. Does anybody know that we have made these discoveries? Nobody outside the office, said Mansus. Unless what? Asked the other irritably. Don't be a jimp, Mansus. Get it off your mind. What is it? I'm wondering, said Mansus slowly, if the landlord at Great James Street said anything. He knows we have made a search. We can easily find that out, said TX. They hailed a taxi and drove to Great James Street. That respectable thoroughfare was wrapped in sleep, and it was some time before the landlord could be aroused. Recognizing TX, he checked his sarcasm, which he had prepared for a keyless lodger, and led the way into the drawing-room. You didn't tell me not to speak about it, Mr. Meredith, he said, in an aggrieved tone, and as a matter of fact, I have spoken to nobody, except the gentleman who called the same day. What did he want? Asked TX. He said he had only just discovered that Mr. Vassalaro had stayed with me, and he wanted to pay whatever rent was due, replied the other. What like a man was he? Asked TX. The brief description the man gave sent a cold chill to the commissioner's heart. Cara for a ducat, he said, and swore long and variously. Cadogan Square, he ordered. His ring was answered promptly. Mr. Cara was out of town, had indeed been out of town since Saturday. This much the manservant explained with a suspicious eye upon his visitors, remembering that his predecessor had lost his job from a too confiding friendliness with spurious electric fitters. He did not know when Mr. Cara would return. Perhaps it would be a long time, and perhaps a short time. He might come back that night, or he might not. You are wasting your young life, said TX bitterly. You ought to be a fortune-teller. This settles the matter, he said, in the cab on the way back. Find out the first train for Tavistock in the morning, and wire the George Hotel to have a car waiting. Why not go tonight, suggested the other. There is the midnight train. It is rather slow, but it will get you there by 6 or 7 in the morning. Too late, he said, unless you can invent a method of getting from here to Paddington in about 50 seconds. The morning journey to Devonshire was a dispiriting one, despite the fineness of the day. TX had an uncomfortable sense that something distressing had happened. The run across the moor in the fresh spring air revived him a little. As they spun down the valley of the Dart, Mansus touched his arm. Look at that, he said, and pointed to the blue heavens where, a mile above their heads, a white-winged aeroplane, looking no larger than a very distant dragonfly, shimmered in the sunlight. By Jove, said TX. What an excellent way for a man to escape. It's about the only way, said Mansus. The significance of the aeroplane was borne in upon TX a few minutes later when he was held up by an armed guard. A glance at his card was enough to pass him. What is the matter? He asked. A prisoner has escaped, said the sentry. Escaped? By aeroplane? Asked TX. I don't know anything about aeroplanes, sir. All I know is that one of the working party got away. The car came to the gates of the prison, and TX sprang out, followed by his assistant. He had no difficulty in finding the governor, a greatly perturbed man, for an escape is a serious matter. The official was inclined to be brusque in his manner, but again the magic card produced a soothing effect. Figure the warden didn't want to piss off like the number 2 guy at the National Police? I am rather rattled, said the governor. One of my men has got away. I suppose you know that. And I am afraid another of your men is going away, sir, said TX, who had a curious reverence for military authority. He produced his paper and laid it on the governor's table. This is an order for the release of John Lexman, convicted under sentence of 15 years penal servitude. The governor looked at it. Dated last night, he said, and breathed a long sigh of relief. Thank the Lord. That is the man who escaped. Except he was already pardoned and free by the time he did the escape, so maybe not? At least the warden thinks he's off the hook. Holy time jump, Batman. Chapter 8. 2 years after the events just described, TX, journeying up to London from Bath, was attracted by a paragraph in the Morning Post. It told him briefly that Mr. Remington Kara, the influential leader of the Greek colony, had been the guest of honor at a dinner of the Hellenic Society. TX had only seen Kara for a brief space of time following that tragic morning, when he had discovered not only that his best friend had escaped from Dartmoor prison and disappeared, as it were, from the world at a moment when his pardon would have been signed, but that that friend's wife had also vanished from the face of the earth. At the same time, it might, as even TX admitted, have been the veriest coincidence that Kara had also cleared out of London to reappear at the end of 6 months. Any question addressed to him concerning the whereabouts of the two unhappy people was met with a bland expression of ignorance as to their whereabouts. John Lexman was somewhere in the world, hiding as he believed from justice, and with him was his wife. TX had no doubt in his mind as to this solution of the puzzle. He had caused to be published the story of the pardon, and the circumstances under which that pardon had been secured, and he had, moreover, arranged for an advertisement to be inserted into the principal papers of every European country. It was a moot question among the departmental lawyers as to whether John Lexman was not guilty of a technical and punishable offense for prison breaking, but this possibility did not keep TX awake at nights. The circumstances of the escape had been carefully examined. The warder responsible had been discharged from the service and had almost immediately purchased for himself a beer house in Falmouth for a sum which left no doubt in the official mind that he had been the recipient of a heavy bribe. Who had been the guiding spirit in that escape? Mrs. Lexman or Kara? It was impossible to connect Kara with the event. The motor car had been traced to Exeter, where it had been hired by a foreign-looking gentleman, but the chauffeur, whoever he was, had made good his escape. An inspection of Kara's hangars at Wembley showed that his 2 monoplanes had not been removed, and TX failed entirely to trace the owner of the machine he had seen flying over Dartmoor on the fatal morning. TX was somewhat baffled and a little amused by the disinclination of the authorities to believe that the escape had been effected by this method at all. All the events of the trial came back to him as he watched the landscape spinning past. He set down the newspaper with a little sigh, put his feet on the cushions of the opposite seat, and gave himself up to reverie. Presently, he returned to his journals and searched them idly for something to interest him in the final stretch of journey between Newbury and Paddington. Presently, he found it in a 2-column article with the uninspiring title, The Mineral Wealth of Tierra del Fuego. It was written brightly with a style which is at once easy and informative. It told of adventures in the marshes behind St. Sebastian Bay, and journeys up the Guaraz-Kelman River, of nights spent in primeval forests and ended in a geological survey, wherein the commercial value of syenite, porphyry, trachyte, and dialite were severally canvassed. The article was signed GG. It is said of TX that his greatest virtue was his curiosity. He had at the tip of his fingers the names of all the big explorers and author-travelers, and for some reason he could not place GG to his satisfaction. In fact, he had an absurd desire to interpret the initials into George Grossmith. His inability to identify the writer irritated him, and his first act on reaching his office was to telephone to one of the literary editors of the Times whom he knew. "Not my department," was the chilly reply, "and besides, we never give away the names of our contributors. Speaking as a person outside the office, I should say that GG was George Gathercole, the explorer, you know, the fellow who had an arm chewed off by a lion or something." "George Gathercole," repeated TX. "What an ass I am." "Yes," said the voice at the other end of the wire, and he had rung off before TX could think of something to say. What an ass I am. Yes. Click. Having elucidated this little sideline of mystery, the matter passed from the young commissioner's mind. It happened that morning that his work consisted of dealing with John Lexman's estate. With the disappearance of the couple, he had taken over control of their belongings. It had not embarrassed him to discover that he was an executor under Lexman's will, for he had already acted as trustee to the wife's small estate, and had been one of the parties to the anti-nuptial contract which John Lexman had made before his marriage. The estate revenues had increased very considerably. All the vanished author's books were selling as they had never sold before, and the executor's work was made the heavier by the fact that Grace Lexman had possessed an aunt who had most inconsiderately died, leaving a considerable fortune to her unhappy niece. "I will keep the trusteeship another year," he told the solicitor who came to consult him that morning. "At the end of that time, I shall go to the court for relief." "Do you think they will ever turn up?" asked the solicitor, an elderly and unimaginative man. "Of course they'll turn up," said T.X. impatiently. "All the heroes of Lexman's books turn up sooner or later. He will discover himself to us at the suitable moment, and we shall be properly thrilled." That Lexman would return, he was sure. It was a faith from which he did not swerve. He had as implicit a confidence that one day or other, Kara, the Magnificent, would play into his hands. There were some queer stories in circulation concerning the Greek, but on the whole they were stories and rumors, which were difficult to separate from the malicious gossip which invariably attaches itself to the rich and to the successful. One of these was that Kara desired something more than an Albanian chieftainship, which he undoubtedly enjoyed. There were whispers of wider and higher ambitions. Though his father had been born a Greek, he had indubitably descended in a direct line from one of those old imprets of Albania who had exercised their brief authority over that turbulent land. The man's passion was for power. To this end he did not spare himself. It was said that he utilized his vast wealth for this reason, and none other, and that whatever might have been the irregularities of his youth, and there were adduced concrete instances, he was working toward an end with a singleness of purpose from which it was difficult to withhold admiration. T.X. kept in his locked desk a little red book, steel-bound and triple-locked, which he called his Scandalaria. In this he inscribed in his own irregular writing the tidbits which might not be published, and which often helped an investigator to light upon the missing threads of a problem. In truth, he scorned no source of information, and was conscienceless in the compilation of this somewhat chaotic record. The affairs of John Lexman recalled Kara, and Kara's great reception. Mansus would have made arrangements to secure a verbatim report of the speeches which were made, and these would be in his hands by that night. Mansus did not tell him that Kara was financing some very influential people indeed, that a certain Undersecretary of State with a great number of very influential relations had been saved from bankruptcy by the timely advances which Kara had made. This T.X. had obtained through sources which might be hastily described as discreditable. Mansus knew of the Baccarat establishment in Albemarle Street, but he did not know that the neurotic wife of a very great man indeed, no less than the Minister of Justice, was a frequent visitor to that establishment, and that she had lost in one night some £6,000. In these circumstances, it was remarkable, thought T.X., that she should report to the police so small a matter as the petty pilfering of servants. This, however, she had done, and whilst the lesser officers of Scotland Yard were interrogating pawnbrokers, the men higher up were genuinely worried by the lady's own lapses from grace. It was all sordid, but unfortunately conventional, because highly placed people will always do underbred things, where money or women are concerned. But it was necessary, for the proper conduct of the department which T.X. directed, that however sordid and however conventional might be the errors which the great ones of the earth committed, they should be filed for reference. The motto which T.X. went upon in life was, "You never know." The Minister of Justice was a very important person, for he was a personal friend of half the monarchs of Europe. A poor man, with 2 or 3,000 a year of his own, with no very definite political views and uncommitted to the more violent policies of either party. He succeeded in serving both, with profit to himself, and without earning the obloquy of either. Though he did not pursue the blatant policy of the Vicar of Bray, yet it is fact, which may be confirmed from the reader's own knowledge, that he served in 4 different administrations, drawing the pay and emoluments of his office from each, though the fundamental policies of these 4 governments were distinct. Lady Bartholomew, the wife of this adaptable minister, had recently departed for San Remo. The newspapers announced the fact, and spoke vaguely of a breakdown which prevented the lady from fulfilling her social engagements. T.X., ever a doubting Thomas, could trace no visit of nerve specialist, nor yet of the family practitioner to the official residence in Downing Street, and therefore he drew his conclusions. In his Who's Who, T.X. noted the hobbies of his victims, which, by the way, did not always coincide with the innocent occupations set against their names in the more pretentious volume. Their follies and their weaknesses found a place, and were recorded at length, as it might seem to the uninformed observer, beyond the limit which charity allowed. Sorry, took meds for a second. Lady Mary Bartholomew's name appeared not once, but many times in the erratic records which T.X. kept. There was a plain, matter-of-fact, and wholly unobjectionable statement that she was born in 1874, that she was the 7th daughter of the Earl of Balmoral, that she had one daughter who rejoiced in the somewhat unpromising name of Belinda Mary, and that such further information as a man might get without going to a great deal of trouble. T.X., refreshing his memory from the little red book, wondered what unexpected tragedy had sent Lady Bartholomew out of London in the middle of the season. The information was that the lady was fairly well off at this moment, and this fact made matters all the more puzzling, and almost induced him to believe that, after all, the story was true, and a nervous breakdown really was the cause of her sudden departure. He sent for Mansus. "You saw Lady Bartholomew off at Charing Cross, I suppose?" Mansus nodded. "She went alone?" "She took her maid, but otherwise she was alone. I thought she looked ill." "She has been looking ill for months past," said T.X., without any visible expression of sympathy. "Did she take Belinda Mary?" Mansus was puzzled. "Belinda Mary?" he repeated slowly. "Oh, you mean the daughter? No, she's at school somewhere in France." T.X. whistled a snatch of a popular song, closed the little red book with a snap, and replaced it in his desk. "I wonder where on earth people dig up names like Belinda Mary," he mused. "Belinda Mary must be rather a weird little animal. The Lord forgive me for speaking so about my betters. If heredity counts for anything, she ought to be something between a head waiter and a pack of cards. Have you lost anything?" Mansus was searching his pockets. "I made a few notes, some questions I wanted to ask you about, and Lady Bartholomew was the subject of one of them. I have had her under observation for 6 months. Do you want it kept up?" T.X. thought a while, then shook his head. "I am only interested in Lady Bartholomew, insofar as Kara is interested in her. There's a criminal for you, my friend," he added, admiringly. Mansus, busily engaged in going through the bundle of letters, slips of paper, and little notebooks he had taken from his pocket, sniffed audibly. "Have you a cold?" asked T.X. politely. "No, sir," was the reply. "Only, I haven't much opinion of Kara as a criminal. Besides, what has he got to be a criminal about? He has all that he requires in the money department. He's one of the most popular people in London, and certainly one of the best-looking men I've ever seen in my life. He needs nothing." T.X. regarded him scornfully. "You're a poor blind brute," he said, shaking his head. "Don't you know that great criminals are never influenced by material desires, or by the prospect of concrete gains? The man who robs his employer's till in order to give the girl of his heart the 25 pearl and ruby brooch her soul desires, gains nothing but the glow of satisfaction which comes to the man who is well thought of. The majority of crimes in the world are committed by people for the same reason. They want to be thought well of. Here is Dr. X, who murdered his wife because she was a drunkard and a slut, and he dared not leave her for fear the neighbors would have doubts as to his respectability. Here is another gentleman who murders his wives in their baths in order that he should keep up some sort of position and earn the respect of his friends and his associates. Nothing roused him more quickly to a frenzy of passion than the suggestion that he was not respectable. Here is the great financier who has embezzled $1.25 million, not because he needed money, but because people looked up to him. Therefore, he must build great mansions, submarine pleasure courts, and must lay out huge estates, because he wished that he should be thought well of. Mansus sniffed again. What about the man who half murders his wife? Does he do that to be thought well of? He asked, with a tinge of sarcasm. The lowbrow who beats his wife, my poor Mansus, he said, does so because she doesn't think well of him. That is our ruling passion, our national characteristic, the primary cause of most crimes, big or little. That is why Kara is a bad criminal and will, as I say, end his life very violently. He took down his glossy silk hat from the peg and slipped into his overcoat. I am going down to see my friend Kara, he said. I have a feeling that I should like to talk with him. He might tell me something. His acquaintance with Kara's menage had been mere hearsay. He had interviewed the Greek once after his return, but since all his efforts to secure information concerning the whereabouts of John Lexman and his wife, the main reason for his visit, had been in vain, he had not repeated his visit. The house in Cadogan Square was a large one, occupying a corner site. It was peculiarly English in appearance, with its window boxes, its discreet curtains, its polished brass and enameled doorway. It had been the townhouse of Lord Henry Gratham, that eccentric connoisseur of wine and follower of witless pleasure. It had been built by him round a bottle of port, as his friend said, meaning thereby that his first consideration had been the cellarage of the house, and that when those cellars had been built and provision made for the safe storage of his priceless wines, the house had been built without the architects being greatly troubled by his lordship. The double cellars of Gratham House had, in their time, been one of the sights of London. When Henry Gratham lay under 8 feet of Congo earth, he was killed by an elephant whilst on a hunting trip. His executors had been singularly fortunate in finding an immediate purchaser. Rumor had it that Kara, who was no lover of wine, had bricked up the cellars, and their very existence passed into domestic legendary. The door was opened by a well-dressed and deferential manservant, and T.X. was ushered into the hall. A fire burnt cheerily in a bronze grate, and T.X. had a glimpse of a big oil painting of Kara above the marble mantelpiece. Mr. Kara is very busy, sir, said the man. Just take in my card, said T.X. I think he may care to see me. The man bowed, produced from some mysterious corner a silver salver, and glided upstairs in that manner which well-trained servants have, a manner which seems to call for no bodily effort. In a minute he returned. Will you come this way, sir, he said, and led the way up a broad flight of stairs. At the head of the stairs was a corridor which ran to the left and to the right. From this there gave 4 rooms, one at the extreme end of the passage on the right, one on the left, and 2 at fairly regular intervals in the center. When the man's hand was on one of the doors, T.X. asked quietly, I think I've seen you before somewhere, my friend. The man smiled. It is very possible, sir. I was a waiter at the Constitutional for some time. T.X. nodded. That is where it must have been, he said. The man opened the door and announced a visitor. T.X. found himself in a large room, very handsomely furnished, but just lacking that sense of coziness and comfort which is the feature of the Englishman's home. Kara rose from behind a big writing table and came with a smile and a quick step to greet the visitor. This is a most unexpected pleasure, he said, and shook hands warmly. T.X. had not seen him for a year, and found very little change in this strange young man. He could not be more confident than he had been, nor bear himself with a more graceful carriage. Whatever social success he had achieved, it had not spoiled him, for his manner was as genial and easy as ever. I think that will do, Miss Holland, he said, turning to the girl who, with a notebook in hand, stood by the desk. Evidently, thought TX, our Hellenic friend has a pretty taste in secretaries. In that one glance, he took her all in, from the bronze brown of her hair to her neat foot. TX was not readily attracted by members of the opposite sex. He was self-confessed a predestined bachelor, finding life and its incidents too absorbing to give his whole mind to the serious problem of marriage, or to contract responsibilities and interests which might divert his attention from what he believed was the greater game. Yet he must be a man of stone to resist the freshness, the beauty and the youth of this straight, slender girl, the pink and whiteness of her, the aliveness and buoyancy, and the thrilling sense of vitality she carried in her very presence. It's a good thing that Mansus isn't Hastings. He'd already be proposing marriage to the secretary. What is the weirdest name you have ever heard? Asked Kara laughingly. I ask you, because Miss Holland and I have been discussing a begging letter addressed to us by a Maggie Goomer. The girl smiled slightly, and that smile was paradise, thought TX. The weirdest name, he repeated. Why, I think the worst I have heard for a long time is Belinda Mary. That is a familiar ring, said Kara. TX was looking at the girl. She was staring at him with a certain languid insolence which made him curl up inside. Then, with a glance at her employer, she swept from the room. I ought to have introduced you, said Kara. That was my secretary, Miss Holland. Rather a pretty girl, isn't she? Very, said TX, recovering his breath. I like pretty things around me, said Kara, and somehow the complacency of the remark annoyed the detective more than anything Kara had ever said to him. The Greek went to the mantelpiece and, taking down a silver cigarette box, opened and offered it to his visitor. Kara was wearing a gray lounge suit, and although gray is a very trying color for a foreigner to wear, this suit fitted his splendid figure and gave him just that bulk which he needed. You are a most suspicious man, Mr. Meredith, he smiled. Suspicious? I? Asked the innocent TX. Kara nodded. I am sure you want to inquire into the character of all my present staff. I am perfectly satisfied that you will never be at rest until you learn the antecedents of my cook, my valet, my secretary. TX held up his hand with a laugh. Spare me, he said. It is one of my failings, I admit, but I have never gone much farther into your domestic affairs than to pry into the antecedents of your very interesting chauffeur. A little cloud passed over Kara's face, but it was only momentary. Oh, Brown, he said airily, with just a perceptible pause between the two words. It used to be Smith, said TX, but no matter. His name is really Poropoulos. Oh, Poropoulos, said Kara gravely. I dismissed him a long time ago. Pensioned hire, too, I understand, said TX. The other looked at him a while, then, I am very good to my old servants, he said slowly, and changing the subject. To what good fortune do I owe this visit? TX selected a cigarette before he replied. I thought you might be of some service to me, he said, apparently giving his whole attention to the cigarette. Nothing would give me greater pleasure, said Kara, a little eagerly. I am afraid you have not been very keen on continuing what I hoped would have ripened into a valuable friendship. More valuable to me, perhaps, he smiled, than to you. I'm a very shy man, said the shameless TX, difficult to a fault, and rather apt to underrate my social attractions. I've come to you now because you know everybody. By the way, how long have you had your secretary? He asked abruptly. Kara looked up at the ceiling for inspiration. 3 months, he corrected. A very efficient young lady who came to me from one of the training establishments. Somewhat uncommunicative, better educated than most girls in her position. For example, she speaks and writes modern Greek fairly well. A treasure, suggested TX. Unusually so, said Kara. She lives in Marylebone Road, 86A is the address. She has no friends, spends most of her evenings in her room, is eminently respectable, and a little chilling in her attitude to her employer. TX shot a swift glance at the other. Why do you tell me all this? He asked. To save you the trouble of finding out, replied the other coolly. That insatiable curiosity, which is one of the equipments of your profession, would, I feel sure, induce you to conduct investigations for your own satisfaction. TX laughed. May I sit down? He said. The other wheeled an armchair across the room, and TX sank into it. He leant back and crossed his legs, and was, in a second, the personification of ease. I think you are a very clever man, Monsieur Kara, he said. The other looked down at him this time without amusement. Not so clever that I can discover the object of your visit, he said, pleasantly enough. It is very simply explained, said TX. You know everybody in town. You know, amongst other people, Lady Bartholomew. I know the lady very well indeed, said Kara readily. Too readily, in fact, for the rapidity with which answer had followed question suggested to TX that Kara had anticipated the reason for the call. Have you any idea, asked TX, speaking with deliberation, as to why Lady Bartholomew has gone out of town at this particular moment? Kara laughed. What an extraordinary question to ask me, as though Lady Bartholomew confided her plans to one who is little more than a chance acquaintance. And yet, said TX, contemplating the burning end of his cigarette, you know her well enough to hold her promissory note. Promissory note? Said the other. His tone was of involuntary surprise, and TX swore softly to himself, for now he saw the faintest shade of relief in Kara's face. The commissioner realized that he had committed an error. He had been far too definite. When I say promissory note, he went on easily, as though he had noticed nothing, I mean, of course, the securities which the debtor invariably gives to one from whom he or she has borrowed large sums of money. Kara made no answer, but opening a drawer of his desk, he took out a key and brought it across to where TX was sitting. Here is the key to my safe, he said quietly. You are at liberty to go carefully through its contents and discover for yourself any promissory note which I hold from Lady Bartholomew. My dear fellow, you don't imagine I'm a moneylender, do you? He said in an injured tone. Nothing was further from my thoughts, said TX, untruthfully. But the other pressed the key upon him. I should be awfully glad if you would look for yourself, he said earnestly. I feel that in some way you associate Lady Bartholomew's illness with some horrible act of usury on my part. Will you satisfy yourself, and in so doing satisfy me? Now, any ordinary man, and possibly any ordinary detective, would have made the conventional answer. He would have protested that he had no intention of doing anything of the sort. He would have uttered, if he were a man in the position which TX occupied, the conventional statement that he had no authority to search the private papers, and that he would certainly not avail himself of the other's kindness. But TX was not an ordinary person. He took the key and balanced it lightly in the palm of his hand. Is this the key of the famous bedroom safe? He said banteringly. Kara was looking down at him with a quizzical smile. It isn't the safe you once opened in my absence on one memorable occasion, Mr. Meredith. As you probably know, I have changed that safe. But perhaps you don't feel equal to the task. On the contrary, said TX calmly, and rising from the chair, I am going to put your good faith to the test. For answer, Kara walked to the door and opened it. Let me show you the way, he said politely. He passed along the corridor and entered the apartment at the end. The room was a large one and lighted by one big square window, which was protected by steel bars. In the grate, which was broad and high, a huge fire was burning, and the temperature of the room was unpleasantly close, despite the coldness of the day. That is one of the eccentricities which you, as an Englishman, will never excuse in me, said Kara. Near the foot of the bed, let into and flush with the wall, was a big green door of the safe. Here you are, Mr. Meredith, said Kara. All the precious secrets of Remington Kara are yours for the seeking. I am afraid I've had my trouble for nothing, said TX, making no attempt to use the key. That is an opinion which I share, said Kara with a smile. Curiously enough, said TX, I mean just what you mean. He handed the key to Kara. Won't you open it? Asked the Greek. TX shook his head. The safe, as far as I can see, is a Magnus. The key which you have been kind enough to give me is legibly inscribed upon the handle, Chubb. My experience as a police officer has taught me that Chubb keys very rarely open Magnus safes. Kara uttered an exclamation of annoyance. How stupid of me, he said. Yet now I remember. I sent the key to my bankers before I went out of town. I only came back this morning, you know. I will send for it at once." "Pray don't trouble," murmured TX politely. He took from his pocket a little flat leather case and opened it. It contained a number of steel implements of curious shape, which were held in position by a leather loop along the center of the case. From one of these loops he extracted a handle and deftly fitted something that looked like a steel awl to the socket in the handle. Looking in wonder and with no little apprehension, Kara saw that the awl was bent at the head. What are you going to do?" he asked, a little alarmed. "I'll show you," said TX pleasantly. Very gingerly he inserted the instrument in the small keyhole and turned it cautiously, first one way and then the other. There was a sharp click, followed by another. He turned the handle, and the door of the safe swung open. "Simple, isn't it?" he asked politely. In that second of time, Kara's face had undergone a transformation. The eyes which met TX Meredith's blazed with an almost insane fury. With a quick stride, Kara placed himself before the open safe. "I think this has gone far enough, Mr. Meredith," he said harshly. "If you wish to search my safe, you must get a warrant." TX shrugged his shoulders and, carefully unscrewing the instrument he had employed and replacing it in the case, he returned it to his inside pocket. "It was at your invitation, my dear Monsieur Kara," he said suavely. "Of course, I knew that you were putting a bluff up on me with the key, and that you had no more intention of letting me see the inside of your safe than you had of telling me exactly what happened to John Lexman." The shot went home. The face which was thrust into the commissioner's was ridged and veined with passion. The lips were turned back to show the big, white, even teeth. The eyes were narrowed to slits, the jaw thrust out, and almost every semblance of humanity had vanished from his face. You, he hissed, and his clawing hands moved suspiciously backward. "Put up your hands," said TX sharply, "and be damned quick about it." In a flash the hands went up, for the revolver which TX held was pressed uncomfortably against the third button of the Greek's waistcoat. "That's not the first time you've been asked to put up your hands, I think," said TX pleasantly. His own left hand slipped round to Kara's hip pocket. He found something in the shape of a cylinder and drew it from out of the pocket. To his surprise, it was not a revolver, not even a knife. It looked like a small electric torch, though instead of a bulb and bullseye glass, there was a pepper-box perforation at one end. He handled it carefully and was about to press the small nickel knob when a strangled cry of horror broke from Kara. "For God's sake, be careful," he gasped. "You're pointing it at me. Do not press that lever, I beg." "Will it explode?" asked TX curiously. No. TX pointed the thing downward to the carpet and pressed the knob cautiously. As he did so, there was a sharp hiss, and the floor was stained with the liquid which the instrument contained. Just one gush of fluid, and no more. TX looked down. The bright carpet was already changed color and was smoking. The room was filled with a pungent and disagreeable scent. TX looked from the floor to the white-faced man. "Vitriol, I believe," he said, shaking his head admiringly. "What a dear little fellow you are." The man, big as he was on the point of collapse and mumbled something about self-defense and listened without a word, whilst TX, laboring under an emotion which was perfectly pardonable, described Kara, his ancestors, and the possibilities of his future estate. Very slowly the Greek recovered his self-possession. "I didn't intend using it on you. I swear I didn't," he pleaded. "I'm surrounded by enemies, Meredith. I had to carry some means of protection. It is because my enemies know I carry this that they fight shy of me. I'll swear I had no intention of using it on you. The idea is too preposterous. I'm sorry I fooled you about the safe." "Don't let that worry you," said TX. "I'm afraid I did all the fooling." "No, I cannot let you have this back again," he said, as the Greek put out his hand to take the infernal little instrument. "I must take this back to Scotland Yard. It's quite a long time since we had anything new in this shape. Compressed air, I presume." Kara nodded solemnly. "Very ingenious indeed," said TX. "If I had a brain like yours," he paused, "I should do something with it. With a gun," he added, as he passed out of the room. And yeah, we'll take a short break there and come back for chapter 9. Not quite sure what the actual mystery is for this one. Kind of jumping all over time, and it seems like multiple crimes have been committed. Are we solving the disappearance of John Lexman? Are we solving the murder of Vassalaro? Or what's going on? What do you guys think? I'm not at all sure what direction the whole thing is going. And it kind of seemed like TX was a side character at first, and now maybe he's the main character. Actually, we do kind of. If you recall, when Kara went into John's study in like the first couple chapters, they were talking, and Kara had an extremely negative reaction to the candles that were on John's wall or sconces or something. And I believe those candles were twisted. What's odd is they've disposed of Best in Priory, and so in theory it won't come back into the story. So I don't know what the deal is with the candles. I think they were twisted. Wonder. Let's check the cover image real quick. Well, nothing really on the cover image. Anybody else have any thoughts? I think there's one or two other people in here besides just me and Vela. Well, most people are being pretty quiet today. And that's the last of the tea. I'm not varying it very much. It's pretty much always orange pico with honey. Darjeeling sometimes, but usually orange pico. I've got a few different black tea varieties that are loose leaf, but broke my strainer and have been too lazy to replace it. So no, just sticking with the big box of Pico tea bags. Hey, Raven. I do like some berry teas. I don't like the floral ones like jasmine so much, but I do like me some berry tea every now and again. All right. Yeah, for some reason I just can't get into them. Hey, Panda. Oh. What are all the things that I tell you to tell him? I think mostly I just ask you to say hi and say that, we miss you, Raven. We wish you were around more. Yeah, pretty much that. There's an aching emptiness in my heart when you stay away too long, Raven. All right, so let's jump back in. Probably just read one more chapter, I think. So let's read chapter 9. My dear Mr. Meredith, I'm assuming this is a letter, I cannot tell you how unhappy and humiliated I feel that my little joke with you should have had such an uncomfortable ending. As you know, and as I have given you proof, I have the greatest admiration in the world for one whose work for humanity has won such universal recognition. I hope that we shall both forget this unhappy morning, and that you will give me an opportunity of rendering to you in person the apologies which are due to you. I feel that anything less will neither rehabilitate you and me in your esteem, nor secure for me the remnants of my shattered self-respect. I am hoping you will dine with me next week and meet a most interesting man, George Gathercole, who has just returned from Patagonia. I only received his letter this morning, having made most remarkable discoveries concerning that country. I feel sure that you are large enough minded and too much a man of the world to allow my foolish fit of temper to disturb a relationship which I have always hoped would be mutually pleasant. If you will allow Gathercole, who will be unconscious of the part he is playing, to act as a peacemaker between yourself and myself, I shall feel that his trip, which has cost me a large sum of money, will not have been wasted. I am, dear Mr. Meredith, yours very sincerely, Remington Kara. Kara folded the letter and inserted it in its envelope. He rang a bell on his table, and the girl, who had so filled TX with a sense of awe, came from an adjoining room. You will see that this is delivered, Miss Holland. She inclined her head and stood waiting. Kara rose from his desk and began to pace the room. Do you know T.X. Meredith? He asked suddenly. I have heard of him, said the girl. A man with a singular mind, said Kara. A man against whom my favorite weapon would fail. She looked at him with interest in her eyes. What is your favorite weapon, Mr. Kara? She asked. Fear, he said. If he expected her to give any encouragement to proceed, he was disappointed. Probably he required no such encouragement, for in the presence of his social inferiors he was somewhat monopolizing. Cut a man's flesh and it heals, he said. Whip a man and the memory of it passes. Frighten him. Fill him with a sense of foreboding and apprehension, and let him believe that something dreadful is going to happen either to himself or to someone he loves. Better the latter, and you will hurt him beyond forgetfulness. Fear is a tyrant and a despot, more terrible than the rack, more potent than the stake. Fear is many-eyed and sees horrors where normal vision only sees the ridiculous. Is that your creed? She asked quietly. Part of it, Miss Holland, he smiled. She played idly with the letter she held in her hand, balancing it on the edge of the desk, her eyes downcast. What would justify the use of such an awful weapon? She asked. It is amply justified to secure an end, he said blandly. For example, I want something. I cannot obtain that something through the ordinary channel, or by the employment of ordinary means. It is essential to me, to my happiness, to my comfort, or my amour propre, that something should be possessed by me. If I can buy it, well and good. If I can buy those who can use their influence to secure this thing for me, so much the better. If I can obtain it by any merit I possess, I utilize that merit, providing always that I can secure my object in the time. Otherwise, he shrugged his shoulders. I see, she said, nodding her head quickly. I suppose that is how blackmailers feel. He frowned. That is a word I never use, nor do I like to hear it employed, he said. Blackmail suggests to me a vulgar attempt to obtain money, which is generally very badly wanted by the people who use it, said the girl with a little smile. And, according to your argument, they are also justified. It is a matter of plain, he said airily. Viewed from my standpoint, they are sordid criminals, the sort of person that TX meets, I presume, in the course of his daily work. TX, he went on somewhat oracularly, is a man for whom I have a great deal of respect. You will probably meet him again, for he will find an opportunity of asking you a few questions about myself. I need hardly tell you. He lifted his shoulders with a deprecating smile. I shall certainly not discuss your business with any person, said the girl coldly. I am paying you £3 a week, I think, he said. I intend increasing that to £5, because you suit me most admirably. Thank you, said the girl quietly, but I am already being paid quite sufficient. She left him, a little astonished and not a little ruffled. To refuse the favors of Remington Kara was, by him, regarded as something of an affront. Half his quarrel with TX was that gentleman's curious indifference to the benevolent attitude which Kara had persistently adopted in his dealings with the detective. He rang the bell, this time for his valet. Fisher, he said, I am expecting a visit from a gentleman named Gathercole, a one-armed gentleman, whom you must look after if he comes. Detain him on some pretext or other, because he is rather difficult to get hold of, and I want to see him. I am going out now, and I shall be back at 6:30. Do whatever you can to prevent him going away until I return. He will probably be interested if you take him into the library. Very good, sir, said the urbane Fisher. Will you change before you go out? Kara shook his head. I think I will go as I am, he said. Get me my fur coat. This beastly cold kills me. He shivered as he glanced into the bleak street. Keep my fire going, put all my private letters in my bedroom, and see that Miss Holland has her lunch. Fisher followed him to his car, wrapped the fur rug about his legs, closed the door carefully, and returned to the house. From thence onward, his behavior was somewhat extraordinary for a well-bred servant. That he should return to Kara's study and set the papers in order was natural and proper. That he should conduct a rapid examination of all the drawers in Kara's desk might be excused on the score of diligence, since he was, to some extent, in the confidence of his employer. Kara was given to making friends with his servants, up to a point. In his more generous moments he would address his bodyguard as Fred, and on more occasions than one, and for no apparent reason, had tipped his servant over and above his salary. Mr. Fred Fisher found little to reward him for his search, until he came on Kara's checkbook, which told him that on the previous day the Greek had drawn £6,000 in cash from the bank. This interested him mightily, and he replaced the checkbook with the tightened lips and the fixed gaze of a man who was thinking rapidly. He paid a visit to the library, where the secretary was engaged in making copies of Kara's correspondence, answering letters appealing for charitable donations, and in the hack words which fall to the secretaries of the great. He replenished the fire, asked deferentially for any instructions, returned again to his quest. This time he made the bedroom the scene of his investigations. The safe he did not attempt to touch, but there was a small bureau in which Kara would have placed his private correspondence of the morning. This, however, yielded no result. By the side of the bed, on a small table, was a telephone, the sight of which apparently afforded the servant a little amusement. This was the private phone which Kara had been instrumental in having fixed to Scotland Yard, as he had explained to his servants. Rum Cove, said Fisher. He paused for a moment before the closed door of the room, and smilingly surveyed the great steel latch which spanned the door and fitted into an iron socket securely screwed to the framework. He lifted it gingerly — there was a little knob for the purpose — and let it fall gently into the socket, which had been made to receive it on the door itself. "Rum Cove," he said again, and lifting the latch to the hook which held it up, left the room, closing the door softly behind him. He walked down the corridor with a meditative frown and began to descend the stairs to the hall. He was less than halfway down when the one maid of Kara's household came up to meet him. "There's a gentleman who wants to see Mr. Kara," she said. "Here is his card." Fisher took the card from the solver and read, "Mr. George Gathercole, Junior Travelers Club." "I'll see this gentleman," he said, with a sudden brisk interest. He found the visitor standing in the hall. He was a man who would have attracted attention, if only from the somewhat eccentric nature of his dress and his unkempt appearance. He was dressed in a well-worn overcoat of a somewhat pronounced check. He had a top hat, glossy and obviously new, at the back of his head, and the lower part of his face was covered by a ragged beard. This he was plucking with nervous jerks, talking to himself the while, and casting a disparaging eye upon the portrait of Remington Kara, which hung above the marble fireplace. A pair of pince-nez sat crookedly on his nose, and 2 fat volumes under his arm completed the picture. Fisher, who was an observer of some discernment, noticed under the overcoat a creased blue suit, large black boots, and a pair of pearl studs. The newcomer glared round at the valet. "Take these," he ordered peremptorily, pointing to the books under his arm. Fisher hastened to obey, and noted with some wonder that the visitor did not attempt to assist him either by loosening his hold of the volumes or raising his hand. Accidentally, the valet's hand pressed against the other's sleeve, and he received a shock, for the forearm was clearly an artificial one. It was against a wooden surface beneath the sleeve that his knuckles struck, and this view of the stranger's infirmity was confirmed when the other reached round with his right hand, took hold of the gloved left hand, and thrust it into the pocket of his overcoat. "Where's Kara?" growled the stranger. "He'll be back very shortly, sir," said the urbane Fisher. "Out, is he?" boomed the visitor. "Then I shan't wait. What the devil does he mean by being out? He's had 3 years to be out." "Mr. Kara expects you, sir. He told me he would be in at 6 o'clock at the latest." "6 o'clock? Ye gods!" stormed the man impatiently. "What dog am I that I should wait until 6? He gave a savage little tug at his beard. "6 o'clock, eh? You will tell Mr. Kara that I called. Give me those books." "But I assure you, sir," stammered Fisher. "Give me those books," roared the other. Deftly he lifted his left hand from the pocket, crooked the elbow by some quick manipulation, and thrust the books, which the valet most reluctantly handed to him, back to the place from whence he had taken them. "Tell Mr. Kara I will call at my own time. Do you understand? At my own time." "Good morning to you." "If you would only wait, sir," pleaded the agonized Fisher. "Wait be hanged," snarled the other. "I've waited 3 years, I tell you. Tell Mr. Kara to expect me when he sees me." He went out and most unnecessarily banged the door behind him. Fisher went back to the library. The girl was sealing up some letters as he entered and looked up. "I'm afraid, Miss Holland, I've got myself into very serious trouble." "What is that, Fisher?" asked the girl. "There was a gentleman coming to see Mr. Kara, whom Mr. Kara particularly wanted to see." "Mr. Gathercole," said the girl quickly. Fisher nodded. "Yes, miss. I couldn't get him to stay, though." She pursed her lips thoughtfully. "Mr. Kara will be very cross, but I don't see how you can help it. I wish you had called me." "You never gave me a chance, miss," said Fisher with a little smile. "But if he comes again, I'll show him straight up to you." She nodded. "Is there anything you want, miss?" he asked as he stood at the door. "What time did Mr. Kara say he would be back?" "At 6 o'clock, miss," said the man replied. "There is a rather important letter here which has to be delivered. Shall I ring for a messenger?" "No, I don't think that would be advisable. You had better take it yourself." Kara was in the habit of employing Fisher as a confidential messenger when the occasion demanded such employment. "I will go with pleasure, miss," he said. It was a heaven-sent opportunity for Fisher, who had been inventing some excuse for leaving the house. She handed him the letter, and he read without a droop of eyelid the superscription. "T. X. Meredith, Esquire, Special Service Department, Scotland Yard, Whitehall." He put it carefully in his pocket and went from the room to change. Large as the house was, Kara did not employ a regular staff of servants. A maid and a valet comprised the whole of the indoor staff. His cook and the other domestics, necessary for conducting an establishment of that size, were engaged by the day. Kara had returned from the country earlier than had been anticipated, and, save for Fisher, the only other person in the house beside the girl was the middle-aged domestic who was parlor-maid, serving-maid, and housekeeper in one. Miss Holland sat at her desk to all appearance, reading over the letters she had typed that afternoon, but her mind was very far from the correspondence before her. She heard the soft thud of the front door closing, and rising, she crossed the room rapidly and looked down through the window to the street. She watched Fisher until he was out of sight. Then she descended to the hall and to the kitchen. It was not the first visit she had made to the big underground room with its vaulted roof and its great ranges, which were seldom used nowadays, for Kara gave no dinners. The maid, who was also cook, arose up as the girl entered. "It's a sight for sore eyes to see you in my kitchen, miss," she smiled. "I'm afraid you're rather lonely, Mrs. Beale," said the girl sympathetically. "Lonely, miss," cried the maid. "I fairly get the creeps sitting here hour after hour. It's that door that gives me the hump." She pointed to the far end of the kitchen, to a soiled-looking door of unpainted wood. "That's Mr. Kara's wine cellar. Nobody's been in it but him. I know he goes in sometimes because I tried a dodge that my brother, who's a policeman, taught me. I stretched a bit of white cotton across it, and it was broke the next morning." "Mr. Kara keeps some of his private papers in there," said the girl quietly. "He has told me so himself." Said the woman doubtfully. "I wish he'd brick it up, the same as he has the lower cellar. I get the horror of sitting here at night, expecting the door to open and the ghost of the mad lord to come out, him that was killed in Africa." Miss Holland laughed. "I want you to go out now," she said. "I have no stamps." Mrs. Beale obeyed with an alacrity, and while she was assuming a hat, being desirous of maintaining her prestige as housekeeper in the eyes of Cadogan Square, the girl ascended to the upper floor. Again she watched from the window the disappearing figure. Once out of sight, Miss Holland went to work with a remarkable deliberation and thoroughness. From her bag she produced a small purse and opened it. In that case was a new steel key. She passed swiftly down the corridor to Kara's room and made straight for the safe. In 2 seconds it was open, and she was examining its contents. It was a large safe, the usual type. There were 4 steel drawers fitted at the back and at the bottom of the strong box. 2 of these were unlocked and contained nothing more interesting than accounts relating to Kara's estate in Albania. The top pair were locked. She was prepared for this contingency, and a second key was as efficacious as the first. An examination of the first drawer did not produce all that she had expected. She returned the papers to the drawer, pushed it to, and locked it. She gave her attention to the second drawer. Her hand shook a little as she pulled it open. It was her last chance, her last hope. There were a number of small jewel boxes, almost filling the drawer. She took them out one by one, and at the bottom she found what she had been searching for, and that which had filled her thoughts for the past 3 months. It was a square case covered in red Morocco leather. She inserted her shaking hand and took it out with a triumphant little cry. "At last!" she said aloud. And then a hand grasped her wrist, and in a panic she turned to meet the smiling face of Kara. Busted. So, does he have any servants who are not, spying on him? Not that he doesn't deserve it. Oh. Let's see. Well, I mean, the cook is putting cotton strings across the door and has a sibling who's a police officer. So I don't know. I kind of think maybe she's spying a little bit. Well, let's see. I'll grant you that. On the other hand, she's also what, a day employee then? Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, I'm tired, guys, so I'm gonna get some sleep. Thank you all for coming to join me, though. I hope you enjoyed the story. And don't forget, we have our subscriber reading tomorrow. So if you've not yet attended, that's a live read. Right now, we're reading poems by Shel Silverstein and reading our way through The Hobbit. Yes, it is obviously bedtime for me. And that's open to anybody who is supporting the stream on Patreon. Yeah, it is not live streamed. It is not recorded. So the only way to get that particular one is to be there and listen to it live and in person. Hey, little dude. Hope you're doing well. Hope school's going good. And then Friday and Saturday we'll be reading some more Frankenstein and Nicholas Nickleby and playing some more Magic. So I hope to see you guys the next couple days for those streams. Anyway, thank you for hanging out with me. I hope you're having a great day. And yes, it is obviously bedtime for me, so I am going to get some sleep. So good night, everyone. Thank you again for joining me, and thank you for all the support. This has been really important, being able to do this streaming, for getting me through the last year. So I really appreciate every one of you. All right. Good night.